So today I wanted to take a little bit of time to explore and debunk the pro-capitalist theory in economics of the tragedy of the commons. And in order to do this, I have found an extremely cringy and slightly hilarious video from John Stossel in which he's dressed as a pilgrim and going to tell us about Thanksgiving. He also got Thanksgiving wrong, and I'll be talking about that as well. With that said, let's take a look at John Stossel in a pilgrim costume.
You ready for Thanksgiving? Before you eat that turkey, I want to bust one myth. You've heard about that Thanksgiving feast. Pilgrims and Indians sharing food. Sharing is nice in families and sometimes in small groups. But as Thanksgiving approaches, let's remember that when we pilgrims first came to America, we almost starved.
People grew weak and thin. Some swelled with hunger.
That's because we settlers acted like Bernie Sanders wants us to act. We farmed collectively.
So John Stossel, right off the bat, is making the claim that the reason that the pilgrims starved is because they, were doing communal farming and trying to be a socialist like Bernie Sanders. First of all, we all know Bernie Sanders is a sockdem. He's not really a socialist. Especially with the way the political climate in the US is, even if he had socialist leanings personally, he's not going to express it, right? But the real reason that the Pilgrims had an issue is listed on Plymouth's website in a section for kids. So simple that John Stossel can understand it. The colonists had to produce their own food. They struggled to grow crops in a climate that was different from England. Fishing was difficult because most of the colonists weren't trained as fishermen and they brought the wrong sized fish hooks. Supplies from England didn't come as frequently as they wished, so whole years went by without any imported goods like sugar and butter. Things did improve though. The colonists got better at fishing. They began to grow more Indian corn, which they learned to cultivate from the Wampanoag people. And they learned the best ways to hunt and trap animals such as deer, rabbit, turkey, geese, duck, and other wildfowl. The domesticated animals that they brought from England, chicken, goats, sheep, and cows, were increasing in numbers and were able to be eaten, and supplies such as sugars, spices, oil, vinegar, and wine began to be sent over on ships yearly. Some colonists wrote letters back to friends and family saying how good their diet had become, better than when they lived in England or Holland. So it had nothing really to do with the fact that they were communally doing anything. In fact, I will show very, very shortly that they weren't even communal. But the fact is that it had a lot to do with the fact that they knew nothing of what they were doing. They didn't know how to properly deal with the climate. They didn't know how to properly fish in the Americas. They didn't know how to do anything. And if not for the kindness of the Wampanoag people, they would have likely starved to death. With that said, let's get back to Stossel and see what else he has to say.
The corporation that funded our expedition said, grow food together, divide the harvest equally.
So notice the language he just used there. The corporation that sent us here. Despite what he's trying to imply, that in some ways that this was a socialist endeavor or a communistic endeavor that failed, we have an understanding from a book by Nick Bunker, who wrote the book Making Haste from Babylon, the Mayflower Pilgrims and Their World, where he says, far from being a commune, the Mayflower was a common stock, the very words employed in the contract. All the land in Plymouth Colony, its houses, its tools, and its trading profits, if they appeared, were to belong to a joint stock company owned by the shareholders as a whole. So what this means is that Plymouth was not some socialist paradise where the workers were controlling the means of production. It wasn't some communist society where we were all communally owning the land. It was a bunch of people making profit for a bunch of people across the sea. It was early mercantilism. It was capitalism. Capitalism was the problem. The people were not thriving under the way that a corporation mismanaged the colony, did not send enough resources back, and left the people with no experience on how to handle the harsh winters in any of the locations they were in. This was a complete failure. This was a company failing. So what else does John Stossel have to say?
Bad idea. Communal farming creates what economists call the tragedy of the commons.
Oh, tell us more.
Think about a nice piece of land that ranchers hold in common.
Anyone who wants to can bring their cattle to graze.
The tragedy is that no individual rancher is much motivated to try to preserve that land. In fact,
Every
Untrue.
rancher has the incentive to bring more and more cattle to the pasture. So they're going to continue to add cow after cow until the pasture is overgrazed and destroyed.
one way to demonstrate that is to run experiments like this one.
So before I get to these experiments, I actually want to talk about why the tragedy of the commons is actually a myth. So first of all, we have the experience of the Wampanoag tribe, who came together in communal living spaces. The same people who ended up saving the pilgrims, much probably to the detriment of the Wampanoag people in the long term, but their kindness was evident. Within the understanding of their own community and tribe at the time, the tribe recognized the importance of leaving land fallow long before such conservation practices were common. The yearly custom was to hold a meeting and decide where they would plant. They would then turn the livestock out into one pasture and plant in another. A fence viewer was employed by the town to ensure that the fences were intact. Spring of the year was field day, where all the men would go into the woods, cut fence posts, and put up fences. After that, there was dancing and a potluck dinner. So essentially, you had an understanding that you needed to conserve certain parts of the land. Somehow this group of people, who the European settlers relied on for their food and sustenance, was able to understand that by coming together and choosing a spot to plant, and not overusing certain other parts of the soil, that they would benefit as a society. Clearly, this is evidence that the tragedy of the commons is not inevitable, right? Like, these people, the Wampanoag people, literally practiced a form of communal living. And to further just how well they learned to commune with their land, the idea of them growing corn, beans, and squash together not only maximized their land, but made it so they were able to grow more food in a way that was economical to them, both in terms of labor and in terms of making sure the soil didn't deplete. And here I'll explain that. Traditional corn, bean, and squash were important crops usually planted together by the women of the tribe, and for that reason called the Three Sisters. The broad leaves of corn provided shelter from the sun. The corn stalk was a living stake for the beans and squash vines, and the squash vines provided good cover, ensuring maximum capture of rain and minimum erosion. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil, and all three attract predatory insects that prey upon pests. So, over time, the Wampanoag people were able to learn how their land functioned in a way that they were able to grow these crops and produce a lot of food on the same land in a way that created a symbiotic relationship between the three different plants. Why is this important? Because they developed systems and rules and guidelines for how to grow the crops, where to grow the crops, how to communally decide these things. And in doing so, broke the tragedy of the commons. So if that practical evidence isn't enough for you, we can examine the theory that finally caught up with it. Because Western thought took until 2009 to finally recognize the fact that communal living and collective understandings are not necessarily a bad thing. There was an economist named Elinor Ostrom who ended up developing a theory that broke the tragedy of the commons. On the Nobel Prize website, it states, "It was long unanimously held among economists that natural resources that were collectively used by their users would be overexploited and destroyed in the long term." Elinor Ostrom disproved this idea by conducting field studies on how people in small local communities manage shared natural resources such as pastures, fishing waters, and forests. she showed that when natural resources are jointly used by their users, in time rules are established for how these are to be cared for and used in a way that is both economically and ecologically sustainable. So we both have a theory and a praxis that are supported that show the tragedy of the commons is not true anymore, and that collective ownership can function within a real-world situation. And with that said, let's take a look at what John Stossel's experiment is. I want to examine this particular experiment, let it play out, and then I want to explain to you what's wrong with it and why it doesn't actually prove the tragedy of the commons.
This is now your property here. I assembled a group of people and told them the circle is your shared land. You can furnish it with trees, people, whatever. And they did.
Have a tree.
Then I put some fake coins on their property and told them each coin is worth $1. But if you can leave it in there for a minute, I'll give you $2. Each minute, it doubles in value. If they can wait, they can make much more money. Do they wait? Ready, set, go. Nobody waited? There was no reason to wait. Someone else would just grab your coins. Let's change the rules of the game. I divided the land into segments, so each person had his own property. Then we played the game again. Same rules. Every minute, the value doubles, except you can only take coins from your property. Go. Nobody's doing anything. Why are you waiting?
I want to reap the most benefit.
You didn't wait last time.
At that moment, I wanted it now, whereas this is going up and it's mine,
Exactly. When you own property, you take care to preserve it, to allow it to keep producing good things. But we pilgrims shared our land, so when the crops were ready to harvest, we did what these people did. Some of my neighbors.
So you saw that experiment, and it looks great at the surface, right? Like, it looks like he's actually proving the tragedy of the commons. Here's the problem. What they actually were doing in the beginning was known as a free-for-all. Basically, nobody invested in that land. Nobody having any sort of connection or tie to that land will have no incentive, truly, to do anything but take the resources from that land. But if they gave all those people time, and they said, this is your home, and this is where you're going to build your home, there would be an incentive. There would be an incentive over time to talk to your neighbors. And more than likely, in that big circle, what would actually happen and transpire is over a short period of time, all of the people in that space would have to, by necessity, in order to survive, start developing rules around how to manage that land. So a more accurate representation of how a communal or common land ownership would work is if you had a situation in which all the people were told, you all collectively own this land. If these coins are in the center, you leave it there, right? You leave all these coins there for a minute and it doubles in value. And so everyone in the room is then given a chance to have a conversation before divvying up that land or dealing with it. Do you think everyone would have tried to take that land? No, what likely would have happened if the people in there were working truly in their best interest is they would have developed some sort of punishment or ruling against a person who abused that land and said, nobody's allowed to take from the center for the minute until it doubles in value. Something like that, right? Something like that would have been developed. And each person would have said, but if you do try to take from the pile too early, you're off the land. Goodbye. And that would prevent the tragedy of the commons. It's pretty much just a minor example of how that works. And over time, you learn to start sharing with one another in an equitable way that makes everybody well off. As for the second part of the experiment, where all of the private property is sectioned off, that is technically one way to stop the tragedy of the commons, to have everybody own their own slice of land. But that's not what happened with the pilgrims originally. If we go back to the writings of Nick Bunker. He says, under the terms of the contract, for the first 7 years, no individual settler could own a plot of land. To ensure that each farmer received their fair share of good or bad land, the slices were rotated each year. But this was counterproductive. Nobody had any reason to put in extra hours and effort to improve a plot if next season another family received the benefit. So the true experiment that he should have been doing to really depict what the Pilgrims went through is he should have sectioned off the land from the beginning and said to each person, after a minute, you're going to go to your neighbor on the right and you're going to switch places with them. You're going to move to the right and everyone's going to move in a right around the circle. You have all these coins, but whatever coins are in the pile, double, and then as you move to the right, you'll get to take and reap the benefit of that land. You know what would have happened? Each person would have taken the coins just as much as from the communal situation. Why? Because the person would have assumed the person on their right would have taken their coins, so the person's going to take the coins and assume that they don't have to put any improvement into the land. How do we know this? Well, neoliberalism exists. When a corporation in this day and age takes a public utility from a country in a developing nation, for example, pick X country in Latin America that ends up having their resource bought up by Y company in the United States. Does that company have a vested interest in protecting, say, a natural resource like a forest or a river? No, they gobble it up. They eat all the profit because they're not living there. They're not the ones experiencing and dealing with that land. They have no incentive to protect it. What does it matter if the people there lose their resource and right to water or lumber or any sort of natural resource that they own? Neoliberalism proves that this kind of corporate model that the Pilgrims used is quite flawed and will fail because there's no incentive if your neighbor's just going to make full use of their land and you're going to be moved over to theirs. Why do you care about your land if you don't have any access to it? At least in a communal living space, you technically own a portion of it. One could argue that the entire society owns it. So yes, from that perspective, private property was an improvement because you actually could develop and own your land. So this was not a movement from socialism into capitalism. This was some sort of bizarre corporate experiment that was really terrible, almost mercantile feudalism, being mixed together that became capitalism. Nobody, even a leftist, is going to argue that that's not a better system. Yet there's just nothing there. Let's get back to Stossel and see what else he has to say.
Sneaked out at night and grabbed extra food. Some picked corn before it was fully ready. The result?
By the spring, our food stores were used up.
The shortage of food was worse because of a second problem with the Commons. When you share the results of your work, some people don't work hard.
For it let an opportunity for some to take advantage and leave the work to others.
Had that continued, Thursday would be known as Starvation Day. But fortunately, we were led not by Bernie Sanders or other Commons-loving socialists, but by Governor William Bradford, who wrote in his diary,
"After much debate, I, William Bradford, assigned to every family a parcel of land.
He did what I did here. The result?
This had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious.
We brought in a harvest that was more than enough to feed us. After such a success, we never returned to shared planting.
Private property allowed us pilgrims to prosper and have that feast we read about at school. So this Thanksgiving, if you have a good meal, thank private property. Every day it protects us from the tragedy of the Commons.
So there's another issue at play. John Stossel is absolutely wrong in what he's saying there. Specifically because, as Kate Zernick of the New York Times pointed out in 2010, the timeline doesn't quite work. The first Thanksgiving was celebrated in 1621, The system of collective ownership known as the common course was abandoned in 1623, and it was abandoned not because of famine, but because the settlers wanted to make more money. As Jamestown, their biggest problem were drought and malaria, not socialism. Think about that for a second. His entire argument hinged on the fact that the Thanksgiving feast was able to happen because of private property, but the private property didn't happen until 2 years later. Furthermore, it was the teachings of the Wampanoag people, a communal society, that allowed for that feast to happen in the first place. So no, John Stossel does not know what he's talking about. The Pilgrims did not rely on private property. Private property, however, was a better solution than the very poor corporation-imposed economic thing that they had, where you have no true connection to your land. So no, it wasn't socialism. Socialism isn't the problem. And Eleanor Ostrom has pointed that out in a very modern understanding. And the Wampanoag people, in a historical setting, have shown that, as have many other communal societies across the globe historically. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications, follow me on Twitter, in the description below, check out my new Discord, and with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.